Now we can start going more into the essence of this meeting, sort of like the main course and really the reason why we're here, to be able to discuss some of the matters and listen to the experts of the different organizations you have just heard expose the way that they work and they function, their goals, so we can go into the essence and start thinking of how we're going to change. That is why I would like to welcome the CEO of CGIAR, which, by the way, CGIAR is one of the 15 centers which belong to CGIAR. So it's really an honor to welcome at this time Mr. Frank Rijsberman to be able to talk about an issue which is what brings us together, and a question which I'm sure is very, very difficult, and you've spent a lot of time thinking how to answer that question, being what is the grand challenge of providing healthy diets for 9 billion people?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here again in CIAT. I've been behind this podium before, but not for a meeting that is bringing together, as this afternoon, people from health and being followed by 2 eminent nutritionists from the public health side, of course people from agriculture and people from the environment, to indeed consider one of the greatest challenges of our time, one of the greatest challenges facing humanity in coming decades, providing healthy diets from sustainable agri-food systems. Let me see if I can make this work. Yes. So this defines the challenge, the heart of the issue, the projected 9 billion people trying to live healthy and productive lives within planetary boundaries. Now, from agriculture, our traditional focus has been on hunger, on producing ever more food to make sure everybody has enough to eat. But in our effort to produce enough calories to sustain a global population, we have neglected the importance of nutrition. Because yes, there are still 800 million people who are food insecure. This comes out of a report from IFPRI, one of our centers, that does an annual report on hunger, on the food insecure people. And as you can see, most of those are in Africa and in South Asia. But at the same time we know, and the speaker after me, Professor Popkin, will go into great detail here, that there are some 2 billion people who are undernourished, malnourished, who might have enough calories, but they don't get enough vitamins or minerals affecting their health. And there are also, by now, an astounding 2 billion people who are overweight or obese. And that's leading to an explosion of diabetes, hypertension, and not just in the US or in Canada or Europe, the places that you might expect. But these are also graphs from Brazil, and we are extremely pleased that we have Professor Monteiro with us here as well, who will speak about this in much more detail. But we see that the consumption of ultra-processed foods has destabilized traditional diets, that there is decreasing consumption of beans and rice, and that there is a remarkable linkage between the share of ultra-processed products and obesity. And that's not just in places like Canada or the US, that also holds for Colombia or Brazil or Chile or Mexico. And indeed we know that in China and in India, people have rapidly increasing chronic diseases, non-communicable diseases, like diabetes, hypertension, and cancer. So not only though are people not so healthy, because of the food we produce, the planet is not doing so well either. Now, if you're an environmentalist, you would have seen those pictures before. In essence, it's trying to depict that there are limits in our planet that as a human race we're threatening to exceed. In fact, scientists have called this the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, as opposed to all those geological eras that we learned about in school, the Anthropocene is the first era where people have such a huge influence on our planetary systems that we are risking to destabilize the planet. And the overall conclusion of this kind of analysis is that agriculture, or agri-food systems, are the key driver of many of those unhealthy trends. Agriculture clearly is the main driver of degraded lands and their desertification. Agriculture is the main driver of water scarcity. Agriculture is a key driver of polluted water bodies and inland seas. And agriculture is a key driver of climate change. Now, climate change, so far, we've usually heard of, the buses that are dirty, the cars, the energy. We don't hear as much about agriculture as a driver of climate change. But up to as much as 30% of the emissions of greenhouse gases comes from agri-food systems. And because there has been so much focus on energy and transportation in the last few decades, they're actually flattening out, they're actually taking measures, and agriculture has not. So under business as usual, agriculture will have a growing share of that pie, and you can imagine that there will be a growing focus on how to curb greenhouse gases from agriculture. But not only is agriculture causing climate change, agriculture is also very sensitive to climate change. Our food crops, as you can see in this picture, are very sensitive to climate change. I heard this morning that the projected loss of productivity of the key staple food crops in Latin America due to climate change would be an astounding 23%. Or if you want to think of it this way, the areas suitable for coffee production in Nicaragua would be reduced by 80% due to climate change by 2050. So particularly resource-poor smallholder farmers are among the hardest hit as a result of climate change, and therefore they deserve to be the focus for increasing the resilience of our climate systems. So what is the current situation? The food we produce is not particularly healthy, and the planet is not particularly healthy as a result of the food we produce. So I think you might share with me the conclusion that really agri-food systems need a quite radical overhaul to provide healthy diets from sustainable food systems, and they need that urgently. So what can we do? What are the key trends that people have considered? In fact, there are quite a few studies, prospective studies, reports enough. Just show you here some covers that look at the future of food systems. And what do they conclude? I'm trying to just summarize that for you in just a few bullets. They highlight the complexity of food systems. But since many of those reports came from agriculture, they still have a strong focus on production and on the main challenges for agriculture. There's certainly a focus on defining actions for sustainable intensification that represents the environmental perspective that we have, if you like, struggled with for longer to incorporate in agriculture. But in a way, all those studies I just showed you show that, everything is important. It's very difficult to prioritize. But if I need to make a stab on some things that we believe are definitely important going forward, it's nutrition and health. It's looking at food value chains, not just inputs as we used to do, and to focus more on food loss and waste. So let me represent these key trends a bit differently. This is a graphic of all these complex drivers of change in agri-food systems. And there are a few big picture drivers that we need to look at in a bit more detail. One of them is definitely hyper-urbanization. The second one, I would say, is trade, international flows of food. And the third one is innovation, our ability to change and improve. If we pick up urbanization first, it's already been mentioned, but it's hard to imagine how rapidly the world is urbanizing. While I would have to say in the CGIAR, we tend to still talk about the rural population and about rural smallholders. In 1950, when the CGIAR got started, shortly after the CIAT got started, 30% of the world's population was urban. Today, that's more 54%, and by 2050, that's expected to be 66%, fully two-thirds. And as you can see in this picture, the most rapid urbanization is actually taking place in low and middle income countries. Particularly Africa and Asia are urbanizing faster than any other region. Africa is projected to grow from 40 to 56% urban, and Asia from 48 to 64% by 2050. India, China, and Nigeria alone, those three countries, large countries, will account for more than a third of the projected growth of the world's urban population. Now, why is that important? Our food systems are really not yet adjusted to those trends. But we know that when people move to the cities, the things they eat change. They will have more access to shops that sell processed foods. They will have less access to fruits and vegetables. And as a result, in China, for instance, the average urban resident gets nearly a third of their calories from fat, while people in the countryside get about 25% of their calories from fat. And in India, similar studies have shown that people in cities get a much larger share of their calories from sugar than people in the rural areas. And as a result, we see rapidly rising numbers of diabetes in India and rapidly increasing hypertension in China. Now, there was a very interesting study from CGIAR with others. Colin Curry, the first author, I think is here in the audience. Many people have cited as well, and have shown that there's an increasing globalization in our food system, both in the food system and in the diets over the last 50 years. Now, others might show other pictures. I'm showing just one picture here. The study finds that the total calories, protein and fat that have in our diets have increased over the past 50 years, but the global food supply crops have also become much more homogeneous, suggesting that nations will become much more interdependent in order to provide a small set of globally important food crops that feed the world with a worldwide, almost standard diet. So here in this picture, for instance, you can see from a study of the French system, Agrimonde, that of the roughly 30,000 edible plants, the things we could potentially eat, just nine, together with 5 livestock species, provide some 75% of the world's current foods. And just 3 staple cereals, rice, wheat, and maize, provide 60%. So here you can see the production of other cereals, things like millet and so on, increased till 1985 and are now declining. And you can see the huge increase in maize, the source of, yes, in Mexico many other things, but in the US mostly corn syrup, sugar, of soybean and of oil palm. Not surprisingly, corn syrup, sugar, soybeans, palm oil are key ingredients in processed foods. Now, combine that with another trend, that of arable land, and you'll see that the mismatch in where people live and where the land is going to be more and more pronounced. And what that really means is that we have to grow food in one place and ship it to somewhere else. And that's not just for arable land. The same holds true for water. When you hear about water scarcity, many people think that that means there's not enough water to drink. That's not really the case. The amount of water we need for domestic consumption is quite small. The large amounts of water are needed to grow food. So a really water-scarce country like Egypt, it doesn't mean they have enough water to drink. It means they don't have enough water to grow their food. Water-scarce areas, even if they have arable land, are food importers. Now look at this. Isn't that amazing? You hear about the eat local movements. I worked at Google for a while, and we had a special restaurant that was the 15-mile restaurant where they tried to cook only with food that came from a 15-mile radius around the restaurant. But globally, you see a massive amount of food being shipped around the world, and that has changed quite quickly. But of course, it makes us vulnerable. What if? What if you have food price spikes, as we saw in 2007, 2008? One of the first reactions from governments of food exporting countries was export bans. And the Arab Spring, which has destabilized the Arab region and is now leading to a massive refugee crisis in Europe, is caused, in the analysis of quite a few people who have looked at this carefully, by droughts, by rural unemployment, and by rising food prices for the urban poor. Food for thought indeed. Of key trends that we have to take into account when we look at feeding 9 billion people in a healthy way. And that brings also in perspective the need to take into account the needs of people working in agriculture, recognizing that most, or at least many, depending on the food system, of those farmers are women, that we need to ensure that we look after their needs specifically, and that while the farmer populations in many places are aging, we have a specific intergenerational challenge, a challenge to find employment, either as farmers or in the food value chains, for the many young people that are entering the labor market. And particularly in Africa, even though we have this rapid urbanization trend, there are so many young people that still some 60% of all young people in the next few decades will be in the rural areas. And for that same 60%, which is several 100 million young people, agriculture will be the only realistic employer. So thinking about agriculture, yes, producing healthy food, but at the same time producing, if you like, a realistic livelihood for the next generation. Skipping to a completely different trend, and I would say this is a more optimistic one than the one that I've just mentioned. We are living through a few revolutions. One that we all know is the one to do with IT. We all have smartphones in our pockets and so on. One that is much less visible is the revolution in biology. Joe Tomey can tell you about that, and I'm sure he will, but the increasingly cheap and very rapidly more high throughput sequencing technology that you see here is leading to a rapid transformation of our understanding of biology at the molecular level. That has led private sector companies to complete reorganization of their labs, of the way they breed. You know, Joe has been visiting some of those facilities, DuPont, I think he was at. It's amazing to see how much has been invested and how that is changing, how private sector companies, you know, have a rapid cycle of innovation, bring out new products for just a few commercially interesting products. But for publicly funded research, yes, we have some islands of excellence. I think CGIAR is one of them. But really we have to band together to try and bring, if you like, that biology revolution to bear on the challenges that we have been speaking here today. That's not easy, but I would think that that is a major opportunity. And yes, we've had studies from the CGIAR that say if we get together, if we are able to pull together, then that is one of the key opportunities we have where we can build on the core strength of the system. And the core strength of the system, then that means bringing together the genetic resources in the gene banks that Joe will speak about later with modern molecular breeding programs and upgrading the great phenotyping networks the CGIAR has with their partners through the many field stations we have around the developing world in all key agroecologies, and combine that with modern bioinformatics and big data. So that's where we see opportunities, because at the moment, the CGIAR gene banks, the 11 gene banks in the system, like the one here at CGIAR, provide over 90% of all the international flow of genetic material through the so-called SMTA, the Standardized Material Transfer Agreement of the Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, meaning very little material flows, if not from the CGIAR gene banks. But on the other hand, and that's what the iceberg picture shows, only a very small amount of the diversity in our gene banks is actually exchanged. There is a huge amount of diversity, if you like, natural capital, both in our gene banks and out in the environment that we could bring to bear on those challenges. And for that, I just want to say congratulations to CGIAR, who have a real vision to modernize their gene bank And I think we'll hear a lot more about that from Joe Tome a bit later. That's the kind of action we need, but we have other areas as well. You know, we have the other cereals. Ikrisat in India, for instance, has great collections of other cereals and pulses that will be a source of healthier diets, as well as more climate-smart agri-food systems. And I want to give a final example here of CGIAR's work on forages out at Gene Bank, because I understand that now the brachiaria grasses that have come from Africa and have had such a major influence on developing livestock systems here in Latin America are being developed to go back to Africa as particularly climate-smart agriculture. So yes, we have an agenda on more nutrition-sensitive food, rapidly increasing. We have some successes where CG programs have been able to bring more biofortification, more minerals and vitamins into cheap staples that are going to scale. That is good, but we need that in a more holistic picture, and I'm relying on the next speakers to bring that in. But I can't resist showing at least one recent success from CGIAR where Steve Beebe was able to go on the news media earlier this year with a happy announcement that the high iron beans that CGIAR has been developing and that are being adopted at large scale in Rwanda, a place where beans are still very much a staple food, are also going to be bred in a way that beats the heat, as it says, that are going to be more heat tolerant. And finally, a few months from now, we'll have the big climate jamboree in Paris, and the French government is a real champion to bring agriculture in there in a much bigger way than before. We're pleased with that. The French agriculture minister, Le Foll, has announced a big initiative to increase soil carbon. And while there are lots of scientific questions, you know, as scientists we like scientific questions, we do think that it's a great initiative. And in the CGIAR we think that developing climate-smart agriculture for a handful of countries that can go to scale is a real opportunity that feeds into the challenges we've spoken about today. My final trend, just briefly, is that we do have to take much more care of what the private sector does. This is a very interesting slide that shows where the private sector has invested in innovation. And yes, you'd expect to see areas like GMO seeds or crop protection, but would you expect to see large areas related to precision agriculture, showing the impact of big data and ICT on agriculture? Those are really big trends. And for the CGIAR, for agriculture, for publicly funded agriculture, that means sometimes we can work together with the private sector to bring technologies that have been developed by the private sector into our products. Sometimes we can work together with the private sector to develop seed systems to bring CGIAR materials to farmers. Or sometimes we have to decide that since the private sector is investing in a way that we can't really beat, we have to pick our own areas for investment that are different, complementary. So my conclusion slide is that I've mentioned to you a handful of points that I think are key if we want to provide healthy diets for 9 billion people. We do have to take much more of an agri-food system perspective than the CGIAR, than agriculture generally has taken to date, with much more focus on a whole value chain approach, with much more focus on food waste and loss, and for the role of women as well as youth, the next generation, in agri-food systems. We do have to break through the silos of agriculture, health, and the environment, and therefore I do believe that this is an important occasion and the beginning of a much longer conversation. The good news is that we can, we believe, speed up the rate of innovation, speed up the rate of genetic gain, if we do that in a smart way. We have to work smarter with the private sector for sure, and we have to figure out better how we do agriculture in a more landscape-based, ecosystem-based way. I do believe that we do need rapid, urgent transformation of our food systems. That will require scaling up the pace of innovation and will require massively increased investments, particularly in research, to drive innovation. I thank you.